Hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature. Welcome back, Phil.
It's good to be back. I think you were right. I think that this is a better direction than what I wanted to do, which was Vin Diesel's Chronicles of Riddick trilogy.
We fought over season 8.
Yep. Or 2008's The Sarah Connor Chronicles.
I
really wanted to do a Chronicles
You want to do a Chronicles something. But do you know, by the way, who gave Narnia the name The Chronicles of Narnia? It was not Clive Staples Lewis.
Oh, it wasn't?
No, it was not. I don't want to make a long, awkward pause, so should I just tell you?
You should just tell me.
Roger...
Nope, let me guess.
Roger Lancelot
Roger Lancelot Green.
Roger Lancelot Green, who you know what? Right behind me on this bookshelf, I probably have at least one of his books. His retelling of King Arthur is probably somewhere here. I won't stare at this bookshelf for a long period of time, but he was...
This is from the Great Illustrated Classics section?
There might be some up there too, but he had a lot of retellings he did one of Robin Hood, he did some of ancient Egypt, kind of myths. I think he had one on the fall of Troy. I can't remember what he called, it might have been just called the fall of Troy, where he would retell a lot of these classic stories, really in beautiful prose. It's one of my favorite things to recommend to students, and even adults as well too, kind of with like Rosemary Sutcliffe, which I've recommended on the show before. He had... He was friends with Lewis, and I believe it or not, and this will actually come up later this season when we get to On Fairy Stories by Tolkien, is he had, I believe, J.R.R. Tolkien served as his kind of mentor while he was writing his own dissertation on fairy tales.
Wow.
And so he was an inkling himself, and he went to Lewis and gave him the name Chronicles of Narnia. That's where he gets it from. So
okay. There's some really cool collaborations that happen with people that you might not expect. For example, Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming.
Oh, yes, that's correct.
We may have talked about this.
Chitty Bang Bang together, right? Isn't that them? Did Roald Dahl do that, or was that just Ian Fleming?
I don't know.
Do you know Ian Fleming wrote the screenplay for Chitty Bang Bang?
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
It makes sense when you remember that there's like, an evil guy kidnapping children. That's like, this is like kind of terrifying for a movie for 7-year-olds. You're like, oh, Ian Fleming. And if you've actually read any of his Bond books, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. What were they collaborating on, though?
No, they would talk to each other, and they gave each other ideas. And Ian Fleming informed one of Roald Dahl's stories, or the other way around.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Well, this essay that we're going to be talking about today is Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said. It's from the New York Times. Yeah, Lewis had a byline in the New York Times on November the 18th, 1956. So this is the same year that Last Battle is published. So all of his chronicles have now been published at this point. And in this essay we're going to talk about today, he walks us through this idea of why fairy stories. And again, maybe it'd be helpful for us to remind listeners that in this short season we're doing before we dive into some George MacDonald, we're trying to ask the question, right, of what exactly is it about these fairy tales, children's literature, these works of fantasy that seem to speak to us even long into our adult years. And we're actually learning, and Lewis will tell us this a little bit today too, that actually even that question that you and I were thinking through before we started this season is probably actually not a great question, because there still is a presupposition that these are for children, yet adults are enjoying them. And Lewis will even say later today, I actually not sure that's necessarily true. So we're just trying to find out, what is it about these particular stories that just draw us in and have the ability to form us in a way, because they do. And that's what we're going to be looking at today as we read this essay. Anything you want to mention before we get started?
Yes, it is worth Googling the title of this essay.
Yes.
In order to see it in context. In the 1956 New York Times page, you can see what looks like a Xerox copy. It's just a photo of what the page looked like. It's a photo of the scan. And you can see the illustration that went along with it. It's the most 1950s abstract illustration you'll ever see.
It's odd. It is.
I don't think it's very good, but I think that it is very much of its time.
I love the fact that, and maybe he did, maybe he didn't, that Lewis potentially would have seen this. And if you were to look at, which again Phil is recommending, if you were to look at the kind of Xeroxed copy of this page, you would see that about 45% of the page is the illustration right in, or the work of art or whatever it is, right in the middle. You have to kind of read around it. Mm-hmm. It's not like a small little, it takes up a little column. No, it's large, and it has to be the kind of art that we just know Jack would have had a very strong disdain for.
It would have been groaning. But I think sometimes they would make the illustration a certain size so that the page would be full, if thus it was a bit shorter.
Yeah. Well, let's walk through this essay, and it's an interesting one because it is so short, and in some ways it means that if any of our listeners want to just pause the episode and go read it right now, you can find it in, I believe it's on Of Other Worlds is where you can find it in published, but I think it's also it's on the New York Times website as well too.
Yes.
If you have a subscription to that, you can read it there.
The entire first page of results is links to.
Yeah, that's true.
The copy of the text.
It's pretty readily available, and it is, when we printed it off, it's just 2.5 pages. It is short, especially compared to our last essay on 3 ways of writing for children. And yet, in some ways, so much information, so many ideas are packed into this very short essay. I actually found it more difficult to wade through all that Lewis is presenting here than I did on 3 Ways of Writing for Children, because every single sentence seemed to have
such a punch,
a certain amount of weight to it.
Yeah.
So we're going to try our best to walk through this, Phil. It starts out, believe it or not, like this. I'll read the first sentence or two. In the 16th century, when everyone was saying that poets, by which they meant all imaginative writers, ought to please and instruct, Tasso made a valuable distinction. He said that the poet, as poet, was concerned solely with pleasing. But then every poet was also a man and a citizen. In that capacity he ought to, and would wish to, make his work edifying as well as pleasing. And that really is at the heart of what Jack is attempting to communicate, if you can wade through some of the more heady parts of this. Did you know who Tasso was, by the way? Were you familiar with any of his work?
No.
So he's as Lewis says, he's a 16th century poet. And think about Lewis in his work as an academic is focused on English literature in the 16th century. I don't actually know that Tasso wrote in English. I believe he probably would have written in Italian, because he's an Italian poet in the 16th century. And I had to Google him, because the only thing I knew was that he had written about the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. And I looked it up. The name of that work, he has a work called Jerusalem Delivered, which is, as I recalled, about the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. And so he had some work, and he was, as well, a pretty recognized poet, even now in Italy. He's a pretty well-known Italian, but he's not like Dante level, right? But he's still a pretty well-known poet in Italy, and he talked a lot about, kind of literary criticism in a way that kind of fascinated Lewis as well, too. So he had this idea. He said that, every kind of imaginative writer, right, Tasso says, has this distinction between what Lewis is going to call the author's reason and the man's reason. So Lewis begins by trying to think through, why is it that someone writes a work of imaginative literature or poetry, or whatever the form is, as one of the names that Lewis will give us eventually. Lewis goes on to say this, and this is kind of his big thesis that he'll then kind of expound upon. He says, there are usually 2 reasons for writing an imaginative work, which may be called the author's reason and the man's. If only one of these is present, then, so far as I am concerned, the book will not be written. If the first, meaning the author's reason, is lacking, it can't be written. If the second is lacking, it shouldn't be written. So he says there's 2 reasons for writing, the author's reason and the man's reason. And if the author's reason, if he's lacking but between this spark of creativity, this imagination, then you really can't write the work, because where are the ideas coming from? And yet, if there's not a man's reason, we'll get to what he means by man's reason.
And it's man with a capital M.
Capital M, so he's meaning all mankind, right? He's saying if you're lacking there, then you should not write something, which is very interesting. He goes on to talk about this idea of how exactly an author gets an idea. And I think this is interesting to talk to you about this because you are a creative and, in a different form, right? Not in writing necessarily, but you've made a lot of art. I mean, think every people could look down at their phones or their computers, wherever they're listening to this right now, see the artwork for this season, and that existed solely in just your head at one point. All of our seasons for that. If you look at the fantastic work you've done for the artworks we give out to our top tier supporters on Patreon, and then also you've been doing a lot of other drawing outside of the podcast, but just those ones people can see right now in front of them. All of those ideas just completely started in your head. I just like to pause and hear from you. What is that like for you?
Yeah, it definitely related to what he was talking about, where it feels like there's something inside that has to get out. Mm-hmm. You have to get it down on the page. And sometimes it comes at unexpected times. I remember one of the biggest breakthroughs in high school for my drawing came on Christmas Eve. I just had so much energy, and it came out as this self-portrait that I worked really hard on for maybe 5 or 6 hours. I was just so excited to get this piece down because I had an idea in my head. But for me, it's actually hard to visualize the completed piece. Yeah. I have to start, and then I get what feels like little bits of information as I go, and then it comes together over time. Every single piece of season artwork that we've done, I've sent you a final version, and then I've completely redone it and said, actually, here's the one I want to do, because it takes so much iteration.
I think we might have mentioned this on the show. We definitely did it on the Dancing Lawn over on Patreon, but the season artwork for season 8 was your first attempt at season 7.
Yeah.
And I loved it. And then you were the one who's like, no, it's not right for this book.
Yeah.
We started recording the first few chapters. Because again, a lot of times what's interesting is you have to then make the artwork before you've actually read the book.
Yeah, I have no idea who anybody is.
Yeah. For like the horse and his boy. No, it was the magician's nephew. I was like, draw a horse with wings. And you're like, I don't know when that's going to come into the book at all, because Fledge doesn't show up till like near
also,
the end.
Also, it's really hard to draw a horse.
into the book. And you had started doing this for the last battle, and then we were a few chapters in. We hadn't released any episodes yet, and you're like, this one doesn't fit the tone of this book. You wanted something a little bit more harsh, so you went with that kind of brighter, kind of deeper orange that we had for that season, and you felt like there was a little bit too much of lightness and a sense of joy that came through in this season's artwork of these creatures scaling a mountain that didn't maybe feel right for the end of the world. And so you went, but I loved it so much. I was like, no, I want to keep it. And we actually heard back, we had shared, a lot of times we'll give updates on Patreon of like, here's some of the work you're doing. And a bunch of our Patreon supporters sent us messages like, do not get rid of this art. We love it. So I was able to convince you, like, let's just move it to a different season.
Yeah.
But I mean, because obviously when this is coming to you, did you feel, it sounds like it is, Lewis says, it is now a thing inside him, meaning the artist, pawing to get out.
Yep.
It just feels like you have to. Really interesting here. So Lewis says that, the 3 stages for him of writing, but you could maybe talk about any form of creation, right? There's these images or these ideas that just are somehow, and this is a different conversation maybe for a different one of his essays, they just come out of he not knows where, right? Which I know is not the way you're supposed to say that phrase, but they're like just itching and pawing to get out of you. And then what comes next for you? Maybe not. We'll come back to Lewis. Okay, so you have these ideas. You are someone who, for the most part, works in one particular form, mostly of digital illustration. Right? But you have done other work. We were just looking at some artwork from some of the students in our upper school at my own school, and they are doing a lot more experimenting of different kind of forms of which you're at the point as in your 30s where like, this is kind of the form I've settled on as my main way to communicate what's in my head. Is it always just straight to digital illustration, or do you kind of play around with some other things?
Yeah, so even with me right now, I have a sketchbook, and I love drawing with ink. And I think that possibly I could go back to just that.
Yeah.
To me, what's nice about digital is that you can share it so much more quickly.
Yeah.
And there's less of a translation that has to happen. When I was drawing in ink, you finish the piece, you waited for it to dry, you put it on the scanner, you scanned it in, then you brought it into Photoshop, and you had to adjust all these things to get it to look like what it already looked like on the piece of paper. But with digital, it looks exactly like what it's going to look like when you share it with someone. And it's so easy to send it to someone and get feedback. So I have friends that I've known for 10 plus years that I can send them something and they can respond to it. Either they like it or there's something not quite right. And I will go back and forth. And this can all happen extremely fast.
Yeah.
I can make it a change. I can send it to them. They can pull that image down, draw on top of it, and send it back to me to show me what they're saying.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the digital piece comes in.
Sure.
And it took until, I think, 2017, 2018 before we even had the ability to draw on a screen in a way that actually made sense. I tried a bunch of tablets. I tried all these things starting in 2007. And it just was so hard to get set up so that you can make digital art, but we're finally there. And this is what I've always wanted. So that's kind of the reason behind that. In terms of getting stuff out, sometimes I have to run upstairs to get something so that I can get that image down because it doesn't stay around forever.
Yeah.
And the alternative is you can keep iterating in your head, but it's so much more rewarding to iterate on paper because then you have a physical, well, digital, but you have a representation and you can see the iteration happening. So I do things in layers where I'll have the first layer and then the second layer, and I'll kind of make the first layer fade so that I can draw the second layer, and then I'll make the second layer fade and I'll delete the first layer or make it so you can't see it. And you can see the progress when you go back and you turn them all on. You're like, oh, it started this way, but now it's here.
Yeah.
And I think that's similar to what Lewis would do with a draft, where you write the first version, but then you keep changing it and iterate. You can do that in your head, but I think it's more efficient and more effective to do it in a way that you have each version saved.
Yeah, think about the work. And you and I both love writing. We are surrounded by so many of my fountain pens and inks right now.
Quite the collection.
In my classroom, which, did I ever told you that? So behind my desk in my classroom, I have, I don't know, probably about 25, 30 bottles of ink because I'm a nerd. And I had a kid on the first day of school last year ask, it was a younger student. It was like, are those potions? And I just
that's what happens when there's too many fairy tales.
Yeah, there's like this guy's got some potions back there. I was like, yeah, I mean, they could do some special things to you if you drank them. Please do not do that.
Oh yeah, they would destroy you.
I say all of that.
Have heavy metals in them.
Say you and I really love writing by hand. We love the analog process of creation. But there is, think about like poor Lewis having to write all of his drafts by hand. And not only that, he wasn't even like us, where you and I love fountain pens. He wasn't doing fountain pens. He used a dip pen because he thought that a fountain pen just felt a little too mechanical. It's just a little too...
It's a different time.
Yeah, a little too forward, progressive.
But he also had someone else type his stuff for him.
He did have someone. But think about all those drafts just going through. Think about... I love this idea. And so again, so much of this essay, before we get to the fairy tale part and the fairy story part, is about the creative process in general for someone like Lewis. And the fact that, when he would rewrite a draft, what he is doing is all of that time and energy towards that is being discarded, right? Not the actual ideas, but the actual work on the paper is being discarded in a way as he then moves into a new draft. And we know that he didn't really keep a lot of his drafts either. It brings me, though, to this part of the essay where he begins starting to allude to what I kind of viewed a little bit, not quite as Sehnsucht, but as some kind of form of sweet desire that we know Lewis cared a lot about. Lewis says this about this idea that's palling to get out. He said he longs to see that bubbling stuff pouring into the form, meaning kind of whatever the form meaning, whatever he's going to use to communicate this thing, whether it's, he says, verse or prose, short story, novel, play. This is for the writer. For you, it could be all different forms of artwork, whether it's oil on canvas or digital illustration or sketching or pencil, whatever. He's saying he longs for it in the same way that a housewife longs to see the new jam pouring into a clean jam jar. He's saying it nags all day long. It's like being in love, trying to get this out. And I did think a little bit about, Lewis and Sweet Desire with Sehnsucht, this almost like painful longing for something. With the distinction, the difference being with Sehnsucht, it's a longing for something that you can't quite place. Whereas with this, it's a longing for something that you are actively trying to discover. How do I get this out? There is an end, right? Whereas when we think about Sehnsucht, a lot of what we talk about as Christians is that desire is out of this world, right? It's metaphysical, it's supernatural. Whereas, and some of that might be in these forms of art or these things that are being created, but there actually is an end. There's an end to them. I think about, I know you haven't read it, and I'm sure many of our listeners haven't either, and I understand why, but in Lewis's first work of narrative fiction, in The Pilgrim's Regress, he writes about this. In one of the characters that John, the protagonist of that novel, comes across is Mr. Halfways. And again, it's very kind of Bunyan-esque, where it's like, all right, so he's going to be something about halfway, right? Mm-hmm. And Mr. Halfways, to Lewis, as the author, really represents romanticism. Right, and that through romanticism, because I can't remember if I've mentioned how much we've mentioned the book before, but kind of the idea in the book is that John, the protagonist, has this dream of an island, and he's setting out on kind of an adventure, a journey to try to find this island and know what is it that's calling to him that he sees in a dream. And as he gets there, on his way there, he comes across Mr. Halfways, who kind of represents romanticism, and Mr. Halfway is kind of able to invoke this idea of Sehnsucht, the idea of sweet desire. Like he's able to kind of bring forth the images and the beauty that call to you, that kind of make you feel like there is something else out there. But unfortunately, romanticism as kind of a way of thinking, it can't answer any questions about the desire. It can't really say, where the desire comes from, why it exists, or what, or even if it points to anything. It can only, here's the thing, it only gets you halfway there. It gets you to the desire, right? But it doesn't actually tell you where to go next. So in some way, and this is kind of where I see what Lewis is saying relate to Sehnsucht, is the fact that you've now, as an author or as an artist, right, in whatever form, now have this kind of pull, and you've now got to decide what the form is. The way that Lewis describes it is really as if something else is in control. It's not the artist it's not the man, right, meaning mankind here, the man or woman who is in control. It's the idea that's in control. What's interesting about this is this sounds like a lot of very kind of modern ways of thinking of ideas, or even if you think about romanticism here, and yet this is where there is a pretty strong pivot by Lewis, because he's saying that's only the first half. That desire bubbling up from within, the images that he sees, all of that is really, really important. But he then says the man enters in. He says the author's impulse is a desire, and of course, like every other desire, he says almost like an itch is the desire, but like every other desire, it needs to be criticized by the whole man. So here's a really interesting distinction that Lewis makes, is that your desire is not inherently good if it's not criticized by your mind, by logic, by, and we're going to get to what he means exactly by man here. David Downing writes it this way. He says, the man enters into the writing process with his own values and purposes. His desire is to shape the writing towards some significant end. That's a really different thing than let's just create art because it's beautiful and wonderful. Lewis actually says, no, it has to serve a purpose, or at least needs to be criticized for its purpose. Mm-hmm. I mean, what for you as an artist, do you feel that? I mean,
I run into this all the time.
Okay.
It is so easy to just make something. It's almost impossible to make something that means something and to do that well, because it's so easy to come off as like, it's easy to be too opaque and be too clear in what your message is. We've all listened to songs where the lyrics are very on the nose, and this is what the song's about. And it's not a good feeling to be taught in that way, and then, or to have someone attempt to teach you in that way. But it also, I think there's just like a lack of care that goes into stuff like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it might be worth doing a short little detour here into James Whistler, the painter from the 19th century, American painter from the 19th century. I assume most listeners are maybe familiar with his name. They have probably, even if they don't know the name of it, and honestly, I don't remember the official name of it. I just know of it as Whistler's Mother. Most people have probably seen his painting called Whistler's Mother. Phil, do you know what the name of that actual painting is?
I'm looking it up.
Okay, I was like, I actually don't know the it's like something in black and white or something like that.
It's giving me the name of his mother.
Oh, well, I guess, yeah, if you search Whistler's Mother, that might be what you get instead. I found it here just a minute ago. It's Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. So, yeah. But kind of known...
Portrait of the Artist's Mother.
Oh, okay, great.
1871.
Most people know of this painting as Whistler's Mother. It's a large painting.
Are we not giving our kids enough names? Seems like there are a lot of four-name people.
Oh, yeah. You think, yeah. What was Whistler's name? Was it not...
James Abbott McNeill Whistler.
Oh, okay. Good for him.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
1834 to 1903.
So he was a painter, and obviously that painting of Whistler's Mother is maybe one of the most famous works of American art ever. And Whistler's always been interesting to me because he is one of kind of the leading figures, a key figure in the movement behind aestheticism, right? The idea of art for art's sake. And so he kind of pushes back in the 19th century against the idea that art needs to be didactic, right? Meaning that,
Needs to teach.
It needs to teach. It has to pertain to instruction somehow. And what's interesting, I think this is always so interesting, and when I teach art in my classroom, what's really interesting, this was more when I was teaching 7th and 8th graders when we were looking at art together, is at a time when Whistler and then other people like Wilde. Well, he's not an artist in that same way, but as a writer, is kind of part of this movement. Oscar Wilde as well. What's interesting is they're pushing back against kind of both sides of a spectrum, where you have kind of in a post-Marx and Engels movement, you have kind of Marxists who are saying art needs to serve a political purpose. Like it has to be about communicating this. And yet kind of on the other side of that spectrum, you have very traditionalists, especially those in the church, saying, no, art does need to serve a purpose to glorify God. So you actually have people kind of on relatively opposite ends of a spectrum, both saying art needs to serve a purpose. And then you have, I don't know, it's weird to ever say that Oscar Wilde was a moderate on anything, because it just wasn't. But people kind of in the middle, I guess not moderate, but in the middle of this spectrum, saying, what if art just exists for no purpose other than itself? And what's interesting, is that Lewis pushes back very hard against this idea when he comes against the man that enters in, like the capital M man here. Because again, going back to what he says originally, he says, if the second, meaning the man, is lacking, the reason, as David Downing tells us, the kind of man with his values and purposes, his desire to shape the writing towards a significant end, Lewis says, if there is not a significant end, then the art shouldn't exist. So this shouldn't really surprise us that Lewis takes a much more traditionalist approach, right, into having, it needs to have some kind of significant end or it shouldn't exist. We're not really surprised that Lewis is not on the same team as Oscar Wilde and Whistler, right?
Shocker.
What's interesting then is what exactly is that other purpose? And that's kind of the rest of this essay is Lewis attempting to then explain what maybe that purpose should be. Where does he go from here, Phil?
Well, he keeps comparing it to. He compares it to some interesting things. He says this may sound rather complicated, but it is really very like what happens about other things. You are attracted by a girl, but is she the sort of girl you'd be wise or right to marry? You would like to have lobster for lunch, but does it agree with you? And is it wicked to spend that amount of money on a meal? The author's impulse is a desire. It is very like an itch, and of course, like every other desire, needs to be criticized by the whole man.
And that's that quote right there that's so important. We have Lewis kind of saying that, imagination, creativity, subcreation, whatever you want to call it, very much he's affirming that while acknowledging that it needs to be underneath some sort of, for lack of a better term, umbrella of order and authority, of reason, right? And some kind of thing that stands outside of it. I think there was a desire, especially in the Victorian age, and then definitely kind of into the modern age. Maybe not so much postmodern. This is an interesting discussion for maybe another day, how that's maybe changed in postmodernity, and then whatever it is we're in now, if it still is
post-modernity.
if it still is postmodernity. This idea that the desire is good in and of itself, and Lewis is kind of saying, well, it needs to actually serve a larger purpose, and that actually the desire is not the highest purpose. And that goes back to Sehnsucht. The desire is subservient to something larger, and it might be that you were only able to comprehend the Sehnsucht, to comprehend the desire, but that doesn't mean there's something larger out there, right? Lewis is obviously saying this is God, right? This is his creation. It is the supernatural. And he's saying it's got to be put, your desires, even as an artist, need to come underneath that umbrella. And it's actually mankind, right? Our reason, maybe if you want to call it that helps use its criticism to be able to rein it in, to have it go somewhere. And that's where there's a kind of this other pivot here in the essay. And what's interesting is Lewis goes on to say something that we've said before on the show, which is when he says, I'm going to now apply all of this to all my own fairy tales, meaning the Chronicles of Narnia. Mm-hmm. And he says, I never started out. He says, at first there wasn't even anything Christian about them. He said they absolutely did not start out as Christian works.
It was just images.
It was just images. And we've heard this before, right? He says it's images. We know of the fawn, of the sledge, right? All these different things. He says a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion, right? But he says the Christian element pushed itself in of its own accord. It was part of that bubbling. So it just kind of comes in, but then his next job is to then find the form for it. And this is where we get to fairy story being maybe the best way for it. Lewis says, as these images sorted themselves into events, they seem to demand no love interest and no close psychology. But the form which excludes these things is the fairy tale. And the moment I thought of that, I fell in love with the form itself, its brevity, its severe restraints on description, its flexible traditionalism, its inflexible hostility to all analysis, digressions, reflections, and in quotations he puts gas. And to be honest, I am not sure what he means by that at all. Later this season, we're going to read on Fairy Story by Tolkien. Maybe it'll be something to help us there, because I Googled it too. I did some research, could not find out what he meant by the fairy tale has gas. Maybe you can help me out with that.
I wonder if it's something that you can't quite capture. It's not going to take a form. Mm-hmm. Like gas assumes the form of whatever
I love that. Okay.
But if it's not in anything that you can
there's
see,
no form at all. Interesting.
No
that's interesting to think of it that way.
But it also it depends on how many decades you want to go back. But I've heard this is a gas. It sounds like a 1920s.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Slang is hard.
Sometimes, yeah.
It's hard to keep your essays from the 50s up to date with
I assumed because he put it in quotation marks that he's using it in like a slang term, like a more like colloquial kind of way, or else he would have just written the word. But yeah, so it's so interesting here that he's like, I settled on the fairy tale because it just seemed to be the best way to communicate this. He literally goes on to say, and maybe could you read this next part for us? Because this is the most famous part of the essay, when he says, of course the man in me began to have his turn.
Real quick before we get there, I want to talk about the fact that he chose the fairy tale because there was no romantic interest. How does that sit with you?
So this was another thing that, maybe if we had planned the season out differently, if you hadn't decided to go and have a child,
yes.
And we could schedule the longer essays for earlier in the season, which we didn't. They're for later in the season.
Believe me, we tried. We tried to have a kid earlier.
I'm hoping that maybe when we get to Tolkien, because Lewis even mentions Tolkien later on in this essay, he even mentions this idea of, hey, Tolkien's really the guy that we should listen to on this. And I wonder if, Tolkien, in that essay, he does present a really great definition of what exactly is a fairy story. Because for me, I was thinking of, I can think of fairy tales that have a love interest, right? And what he means by no close psychology is interesting. Is he meaning just what Lewis says? There's not a lot of analysis to it. It's kind of very surface level-y in a way.
Yeah, there's no deeper thing behind it. There's good guys and bad guys. There's not bad guys who also have a story of why they're bad.
Yeah, unless you're making movies in the
Yeah.
2000s. But other than that,
From
yeah. But
2008 to
the love
2019.
interest was interesting to me because I wasn't quite sure what he was alluding to here. Maybe we can hear from our listeners here for sure, but maybe also Tolkien will help kind of uncover what exactly that means.
I think what's interesting to me about that is a lot of the stories I read as a kid are the ones that are kind of are considered classics.
Yeah.
They don't seem to have that romantic piece that is so common today. It seems like almost everything today has at least some relationship as a part of it. But the stories I read as a kid, except for the kind of classic, true love's kiss type stories, it seems like a lot of those are just they're adventure stories, but without that element.
Interesting.
There might be subtle allusions to it. Every Pixar movie seems to have some double meaning joke where the kids think it's funny, but the parents think it's funny for a different reason. But that's not a main point of the story.
Interesting. Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, let's keep moving now, though, into
Then of course the man.
Yeah, then of course the man. And we can read that whole paragraph because that is the really kind of the crux of this essay. I've said that there's a lot of pivots here, and again, I really do mean it. It feels like every few paragraphs he's making a big change into what he's communicating.
I'm so glad that I reread this morning.
Oh yeah,
because
sure.
I read it 2 days ago, thinking, okay, I've read it unprepared.
Yeah,
and then everything meant something different, having had better sleep. Okay. So this is from Lewis. Then, of course, the man in me began to have his turn. I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if there were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could.
And there it is. Lewis explaining that the man's motive there is to be able to tell these Christian stories in a way that allows readers to feel the full potency. And what's really cool to hear kind of in this paragraph, when he's like, here's what I was attempting to do, having now, gone through each one of these books and not just you and I talking about it, but hearing from so many guests and then also just many of our listeners, he succeeded, wildly succeeded on this. Like he did this really well. He was able to help us feel these things by kind of stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, right? Even though we were looking for them and we knew they were there, right, we're still able to feel them. It's just really great to be like, wow. I mean, he did do that, but he's very, clearly telling us, the motive here was to communicate these truths. And yeah, it didn't start that way as the artist. It was just all coming forward. But then I used kind of my criticism of as a man, right? Again, capital M man, right? Just meaning as a human, to then take this and actually almost kind of subdue the artist in a way, like rein in the artist in a way to actually give it some, like I mentioned, this kind of umbrella of some kind of order or even really authority, both authority and this idea having authority to the creator, to the man, but also authority under God as well too, saying there is a larger thing outside. This idea inside my head is not the be all end all. It is not actual reality, which is, once we get into modernity and postmodernity, that begins to become really just an enlightenment idea. The norm is, these ideas are what's most true. And Lewis is saying, it's not true. The ideas are not the most true thing. There's actually something outside of them. Yeah.
It's really interesting to see this as both the author and the man being in the same person. Mm-hmm. And I think that I see this all the time with two different personalities. This happens with the show. You'll come in with a really big idea, and I'll respond to that thinking, well, it's something we could actually do. But if you didn't come in with a big idea, I might not have been pushed to do, say, 7 seasons of a podcast.
Sure.
You wanted illustrations for every single season art. At the time, I was really struggling to make anything at all, especially a finished piece. And I think that we see this all the time with different people working together. And
Sure.
almost every company is a collection of people. Everybody is coming from a different place.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah.
really interesting that these are both inside the same person.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting.
And that they need each other.
Yeah.
You can't start with just a man. You have to start with the author. Otherwise, you get a really bad product.
Yeah.
And can you imagine a story that is started off with the intention, we're going to teach blank? No one wants those stories.
And we can think about this so well with a lot of modern storytelling that's like very, and this happened for long periods of time, but just as, so much of modern storytelling is just hyper commercialized, right? Like we've all seen movies and read books too, but definitely with movies, we can probably all think of ones where like this clearly started in a boardroom somewhere. Like, what do the kids want?
Yeah.
Let's just, and this came back to when Lewis is telling us on 3 Ways of Writing for Children of like, hey, don't just give them what they think they want because they want not great things. But it comes this like, if you're starting with the man, you're kind of starting without that kind of spark of creativity, that deeper desire to, to get this idea, this art out of your head, kind of letting it crawl out of you somehow, right? If you're just starting with honestly, you see this with some Christian entertainment too, where it's like, we're going to simply start with, we need to communicate these biblical truths to everyone, and we have no inspiration behind it whatsoever. It's just about that. No, Lewis says, it really needs to start kind of in this order. It does follow this path of the images. For him, it was images, at least. Could be other things, some kind of artistic spark, then finding the form, and then kind of honing that through man's motive, right? So I think that's really interesting. And the other part that's cool about this, about your point, Phil, is I just read Bandersnatch earlier this year, a couple of months ago, which is Dr. Diana Glyer, looking through the relationship between all the Inklings and the way in which they kind of, work together to have all these great things occur, and that it was collaboration between them. And she looks a lot at different other people who've collaborated well together, like the Johns and Pauls of the world, who've really been able to do greater stuff together than they were able to do separate. And it's so interesting that you point out that this is kind of happening in Lewis's head alone. He's still doing, now it's also happening externally because we know that he's sharing parts of Narnia with other people. We just mentioned at the very beginning of this episode that Roger Lancelin, the whole name for the series, comes from another guy, right? And yet that same collaboration is occurring in his head amongst himself, right? In a way, which is so interesting. And there's the biblical truth too, that we know one of the reasons that collaboration in community is so important is because our God exists in community in a triune, a Trinitarian form, and so community collaboration is inherent to us as humans. If we're made in God's image, that communal aspect is necessary.
Right.
To think of that as being both external and internal, though, is very interesting. I love this.
Yes, and if we're made in the image of God, how much of that came with our with our bodies?
Then kind of the way that Lewis decides to end this work is he then keeps asking, okay, well, I think the question for us maybe as readers is, why fairy stories? And Lewis pauses to remind us, and again, I'm so excited to get into more of this later this season. He reminds us that, look, hey, fairy stories are not for kids. Stop thinking of them for kids, right? Which is why I said maybe our question at the very beginning of for this season of, why do these stories meant for children, why do they impact us so much as adults? I think Lewis would say, stop saying that they're meant for children. Just because they are accessible to children doesn't mean they're actually meant for children. Lewis, even says it's only because they're out of style. The same way that we put, that furniture in the nursery only because it's gotten, a little too old. It's not cool anymore. It's not fashionable. We just put it there because, who cares what happens to that? So that's all that's happening with children's literature, right? He then says, for about his own thing, he says, I was therefore writing for children, only in the sense that I did exclude what I thought they would not like or understand, not in the sense of writing what I intended to be below an adult audience. It's like, it's for adults, but I did make sure that it was also accessible to children.
Yeah. This happened with it's Black Ships at Troy. Is that the
Black Ships before Troy?
Before Troy. It is the Iliad, written for children and illustrated for children, is how I interpreted it
at first.
At first, but it was completely for me.
Yeah.
it just took away some of the stuff in order for me to see it,
Yeah.
and then prepared me to start reading the actual Iliad. Same with Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
Take it down a little bit, make it more accessible, but it also points toward
The Ian Cerulean version? Yeah.
Well, no, the Seamus
Oh, Seamus Henney version.
Yeah,
That one too.
Yeah.
I think about this with our podcast. Like, this is not a podcast for children, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it is absolutely maybe not this season. We're a little bit headier topics. But the first 7 seasons of the show, we've had a lot of people who tell us they listen with their kids, or we've gotten emails from middle schoolers before, right? Who are just like, oh, just looking for this. And it's not because we've made it for kids, but we make sure that the content is appropriate for everybody.
Right. We cut down on words like mephitic fumes and oratories.
Yeah, exactly. But we also, like Lewis says, we made sure that it was stuff that would be easily to understand, right? And when we get to something, like we say something is, oh, this is didactic, you jump in really quickly, say, oh, remember, that means it's like, it has to do with instructing or teaching, right? Not as a way of, being like, oh, we're speaking down to an audience. And Lewis says he's absolutely not speaking down to his audience, right? He said that would be patronizing. I'm not doing that, but just saying almost like invitational, almost in a hospitable way of let me welcome you into this. Not necessarily let me speak down to you, but let me kind of, with a broad brush, kind of communicate in a way that welcomes everyone here, no matter your age. And in that way, what we wouldn't want to do, and we do this with some of our stories, is we go, oh, well, that must mean it must be for kids, right? And what's interesting, and I think we'll get into this more and more as we're now jumping back a century in our writing when we get to The Princess and the Goblin, is as I was looking back through the book and thinking about, well, some of the stuff here is, because it's 100 years, it's, or before Narnia. So we're now talking close to 150, 160 years apart from where we are. Some of the prose, you're like, this is tough for a 7 or 8-year-old. Yeah. Right? I was thinking about this recently. I was reading through the first chapter of Peter Pan and by J.M. Barrie. And that first chapter, I was reading some of it to our oldest, to my son, and I was like, this is so far above your head. It is a children's story, but also like there are parts of it that are just not accessible to you, but the larger story is.
Right.
But Barrie is definitely not talking down. The whole first part of it is, like the first few pages is about how everybody falls in love with Mrs. Darling at the same time, and one guy gets a cab to go get her, he marries her first, and even the whole idea of when Wendy's being told that she needs to grow up, that 2 years old is the beginning of the end. And so like, this is not, my son doesn't understand these things yet. And again, it's because that was a different century where those, it's not necessarily being written for children as much as it is being written, and children are being invited into that story. Treasure Island's another good example too, with with the Stevenson.
Speaking of which, one of the things that I really enjoy is we joked about it earlier, but you have the great illustrated classics behind you. Just taking classic works and making them accessible.
I love that I have this. The Wind in the Willows, great illustrated classics. Right next to it, Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy.
Yeah.
I don't know why this is on one of my student bookshelves. I assume that someone must have misplaced it there.
And on top of it, you have Roald Dahl's Matilda.
Yes, that one makes a little bit more sense. I'm not sure Boethius. I have a more, I call it the restricted section, not because it's inappropriate, but it's like, don't maybe pick up. I don't know that The Crucible is one that's over there too. Like stuff that's like, I don't know that 5th grade it's really the best, read. I don't know how much you'll enjoy it.
Right.
I don't know how Boethius ended up there. But keep going. Sorry.
I think there are times when, for example, speaking of George MacDonald, my dad read We Sir Gibbie to me, which was actually, I hope I'm getting this right, I think it was a version of Sir Gibbie, but made for children to make it a little more accessible. But I remember it just being so difficult to understand. He was reading it out loud to me, and it was a real struggle, it was a real push, but I'm so glad that he pushed. But that needs to be done at the right time and in moderation. I think that your son is going to really enjoy great classics.
Oh, sure.
But maybe not quite yet. He's still 3. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not at the time of this recording. I think that it can be too early, but you should still push.
Oh, and I think absolutely you should. And I think, but the way of thinking of it is almost both not speaking down to not patronizing young readers, but also opening, like Lewis says, opening ourselves to, when we grow up, the thing we throw off is the fear of being childish, right? That actually the fear of being childish is a childish thing. Lewis even has this great quote that he gets near right at the end here in the penultimate paragraph, where he says, and this really could be another name for this particular podcast that we have, but Lamppost Listener, we like the alliteration, it's shorter. We could also call the podcast, "A Book Worth Reading Only in Childhood is Not Worth Reading Even Then."
Oh, sorry, I fell asleep.
That's too long. Yeah, too long.
Halfway through that.
But I mean, that's great. A book worth reading only in childhood is not worth reading even then.
Yeah. What would be the abbreviation if we took the first letter of each
A B W R O I and C I N W R E T
.com.
Yeah. And then he also ends too with this kind of just like he ended with on 3 Ways of Writing for Children with the whole what did he, was it Brussels sprouts? What did he hate?
Man, what was that?
Leeks? What was it? It was something. I can't remember what it was. But he then ends by being like, "Juveniles indeed. Am I to patronize sleep because children sleep sound, or honey because children like it?" Like almost thinking like there's a lot of things that children like that we also like, and it doesn't make those things juvenile just because a kid likes it.
Right.
But we have done that with fairy tales, with fairy stories. We have said, oh, they're for kids, right? And I think what's interesting now about this may be a great place for us to end this conversation for today, is where we are now in the year of our Lord 2024, is that the idea of fairy stories being for kids is about 100 years old at this point. We're getting to about a century of fairy tales are for kids, okay? Which means that actually a lot of fairy tales are for kids because they were specifically written not with this perspective, but they were written as, let's write a story for children. What do they like? Here's what you get, right? Which is why a lot of, modern fairy tales don't, there's a lot of good stories out there too, but the ones that still continue to be the ones that really move people in a way, and the ones I think that many of them that are the most commercially successful too are usually still based off of story. Think about like Frozen, for instance. I can't remember what it's what is it? Frozen's based off of something 19th century-esque. I can't remember what it is. It might be a Hans Christian Andersen thing. But again, it's a story that was written when fairy tales.
The Snow Queen.
The Snow Queen. That makes sense. Is it Andersen?
Yeah, Han Solo, Christian Andersen.
Yeah. Hans. With that, you've got a time when fairy tales weren't just for kids, but you think of some maybe more modern where it's not a retelling of something more traditional. And it does seem to be, a group of board executives got together, said, let's write a story for kids. What do they like? And then you get something that might not be a bad story, but it probably is not a story still being told 200 years later. Whereas the Snow Queen is still being told through, some of the most successful movies in the last, 50 years, right? Yeah. And I think that what's really worth investigating for us is this idea that Lewis keeps saying, fairy tales aren't for kids, fairy tales aren't for kids. And yet, for us as modern readers, we can think of a lot of fairy tales that legitimately are written for kids. And they kind of go against what Lewis is saying. But I think the reason for that is because we've had a century of this kind of, what Lewis would say, incorrect thinking about the fairy story, which is, as we get to, especially, again, I don't want to hype up that one episode too much on fairy stories by Tolkien. When we actually get to define what a fairy story is, I think we'll be able to have a better way of maybe categorizing maybe more modern stories and maybe the way they impact us with more traditional stories that maybe impact us or form us, if you want to say it, in a different kind of way.
Yeah. I'd also be interested if we could get a snapshot of what was actually being written and published 100 years ago or 150 years ago, because we see what survived.
Sure.
We see what is still being talked about and still worth reading, but there must have been a bunch of other stuff. In terms of movies, if you can find a way to see everything that came out for a certain year, you realize that almost everything is so bad.
Yeah.
It's so bad. If you a great way to do this is to go to a thrift store and look at the DVD section.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because when you're on streaming, you're seeing stuff that has already been curated for you and is already tailored to your viewing preferences, and you're only going to see so much, and there's still going to be bad stuff that gets through. But if you go someplace that doesn't have any filtering at all, you'll realize, oh man, there's some really bad movies. Back when Movie Pass was a thing and very cheap, there are a lot of bad movies that come out every week. And I had no idea until I tried to maximize the use of my of my membership and go to the movies all the time. I thought, oh, this is so bad, and I would have skipped this. I wouldn't even have heard about it.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm at the theater, you see, oh, there are 8 bad movies, and there's one good movie from 2 months ago. The final piece would be, I think that sometimes you do have to try a wide range of stuff in order to find those things.
Yeah.
Because the other trap is, I'm only going to read the good stuff. I'm only going to read the classics. And that's fine, but I do think there's something to be said for reading some modern stuff. At least you'll have something to compare to. Well, no listener feedback today, a little bit over time, but you want to go ahead and wrap us up?
Yeah, sure. So this episode was made possible by our patrons over at the Patreon.com. Well, it's not actually the Patreon.com. It's just Patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month. You can hear about Phil and I's escapades taking my son to go see Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
In theaters.
And we sat through the entire movie. We made it.
I'm impressed your son made it.
Yeah.
Now, it did take a little work. You had to spoon feed him popcorn. You had to go get some candy and come back.
We did buy candy in the middle. It turns out...
You had to cover his eyes when, spoiler alert, I'll wait 2 seconds, when Qui-Gon Jinn gets stabbed in the chest.
He knew that he dies, but I didn't think that seeing the lightsaber blade come out of his back might be a little traumatic for a 3-year-old. Well, he'll be 4 next month, but still. No one's ever given this criticism to the movie Episode 1, but it turns out the politics scenes on Coruscant did not interest my son.
Man.
That's when we left. I did not see any of the Senate. Well, as soon as that was happening, he was like, I'm out. You know, he really enjoyed the pod race. So it's like, and again, he'd seen the movie before, but just parts of it, hadn't seen the whole thing.
Yeah.
Loved Jar Jar.
Oh.
He was like Darth Maul,
I
Jar
remember
Jar,
loving Jar Jar.
Obi-Wan. He was like, I asked him who your 3 favorite characters. He said Obi-Wan, then Darth Maul, then Jar Jar. And I was like, all right. Did not actually relate too much to the kid. He did not like Anakin, and he was very bothered by C-3PO calling himself naked. He says, I'm naked because his parts are showing.
Yeah.
It worried him and bothered him. All right, well.
Did you see that Darth Jar Jar is a thing now?
I saw that, yes. We're going to watch. There's like a new Lego TV show that's like almost like a what if kind of thing. So, yes, we will absolutely watch that. I'm excited for Darth Jar Jar to now be...
No one is safe in the multiverse.
Yes. It'll be fun. So, yeah, we'll talk about that in this month's Dancing Lawn, or in May's Dancing Lawn, when this episode comes out, I should say. But if you'd like to support the show, you can listen to an episode like that every month with our other rewards. Special thanks, as always, goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ashlyn Washburn, and Andrew Trophy for supporting us at our top tiers. If you'd like to contact us, I should say this too, that the stickers for Season 8 will be going out sometime in the summer as well too. We'll probably mail them in, I don't know, maybe late June or so. So if you want to sign up and get the Season 8 sticker, go ahead and sign up before June to make sure that you're able to get
That's
that
at the $5?
At the $5 level. I think it's called the Lantern Waste level. So that'll be shipping out to patrons there. And also a reminder to patrons who do support us, if you've moved, please change your address in Patreon as well too, because Patreon will send those out to y'all. We're not doing it ourselves anymore. Patreon is taking that on for us, thankfully. So, but it means that if your address is wrong, they will just some random person will get what is this about? You know? Well, you know what? Maybe this is a great way for us to advertise. Just start sending stickers out to random addresses.
As many people as possible.
You can also contact us or mail us at P.O. Box 25854. That's P.O. Box 25854, Richmond, Virginia 23232. You can email us at hello@lampostlistener.com or call us at 406-646-6733. You can also find links to everything we've talked about today, including past guests, reference books, and other things at lampostlistener.com. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and until next time, further up and further in.
See you soon.